Okay, so I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Betty Chadwick, the Executive Director of Active LD. We're a community interest company, so a non-for-profit, focusing on helping people with learning disabilities to become more active, more active regularly, so they can lead healthy and happy lives. And the session this evening is all about an introduction to neurodiversity, with a reference for how that, with how that fits in with our planning of the personal bests, and just a little bit of background behind that. So, in terms of what is neurodiversity, neurodiversity is a way of saying that human brains are all different from each other, which I think is something that's probably pretty well understood and well recognized, that there are no two people, no two brains and nervous systems that are the same. We're all unique. However, so there are some people whose brains work differently from the sort of societal norm, and they're described as being neurodivergent. Those whose brains work in a sort of standard way are described as neurotypical. And within the group of people who are neurodivergent, there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of variation. And we think of it a little bit like an umbrella. So the types of sort of differences and brain differences under the sort of neurodiversity umbrella would include things like autistic spectrum disorder, also known as autism, developmental language disorder, tic disorders, you may know that as Tourette's, intellectual or learning disability, ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, dyslexia, or dyscalculia. I think what's not shown very clearly in this picture, but what is really quite significant, is that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of crossover between these conditions or these differences. And so it's quite common for somebody to have a learning disability and be autistic, maybe have a learning disability, be autistic and have ADHD, and so on. So these differences don't work in isolation. So I think because we know that neurodivergence can affect the way an individual processes information. Sorry, I just let this person in as well. Hi, Jan. So because we know that neurodivergent brains process information in a different way, it also affects the way that they interact with the people and the environment around them and how they communicate. And the personal best is a really good example of a stimulating and busy environment with loads of sensory inputs. So we're already throwing our guys into an environment that is going to be quite full on for them. So in the next slide, we took some advice from our sort of learning disabled and autistic experts in putting this session together. And so I've just recorded little clips of them introducing themselves. So here they are.
Hi, my name is James Parker Burrows. I'm an active LD advisor and I have moderate autism.
Hello, my name is Jane. I have a learning disability and autism.
My name's Anna. I find change difficult. Meeting new people and then meeting new people.
Hi, I'm Stuart. I find change difficult and conflict.
That's a little intro into some of our experts who've helped us put the session together. Let's move on. Stuart tells us a little bit about some of the things that he finds difficult, and I think these are really relatable.
I don't like big crowds. I do not like people shouting. I like being sociable.
And I think I would almost knowing Stuart quite well, I would reframe that to say that he likes being sociable as number one, but he also doesn't like big crowds and he doesn't like too much noise. So autism is probably the most known and most understood neurodivergent condition or neurodivergent difference, but there's still an awful lot more to find out and to understand about autism. So in summary, autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects how a person communicates with and relates to people. It also affects how they make sense of the world around them. We mentioned a moment ago that every autism diagnosis is unique. So although two people may each have a diagnosis of autism, the challenges they face and the difficulties they undergo will very likely be different. There may be some similarities, but they won't be exactly the same. They won't be identical. Autism is recognised in more males than females on a ratio of about 2 to 1. That ratio is changing a little bit, and it's changing because it's thought that girls, or it's recognised that girls are much better at masking and hiding the symptoms or some of the signs of autism at the times where they might be diagnosed through schooling and so forth. Also, the majority of traditional autism testing was geared around boys at school. So the incidence in girls is likely to be higher than what is actually recognised. The other point with autism is that without the right support, it can have a profound and sometimes devastating effect on individuals and their families. So the right support is absolutely key, the right understanding and right support. A little bit more on autism is that it's probably genetically linked. I don't think that's been proven, but I think it's certainly well recognised that there's an increased incidence between siblings. And the photograph on the top there is a photo of my sister Jane and I. Jane has a diagnosis of autism. I am undiagnosed, but most people who know me well are fairly certain that I too am likely to be autistic. Around 25% of people with autism are non-speaking, and we will find that at the personal best. So there will be some participants who don't have words or who can't find words. Being non-speaking can be absolute. So some individuals with autism are non-speaking in all circumstances, all situations. For others, it can be situational, whether they're triggered by other stress factors or sensory input or sensory overload that can impair their ability to communicate through words. I think it's quite striking that within our group, who are people with learning disabilities, about 30% of people with a learning disability have autism, and that is something we ask our participants on their registration form for the personal bests. And certainly our figures over the last couple of years match up quite consistently with this 30% kind of percentage. What's striking there, I think, is that within the general population, the incidence of autism is somewhere between 1 and 2%. So if you have a learning disability, you are about 30 times more likely to also be autistic. And then at the bottom, the last point, the last point there, without understanding, autistic and neurodiverse people and their families are at risk from being isolated and developing mental health problems. A really big part of the personal best, not only to help encourage being active and being a little bit sporty, but a huge part of the personal best is about that social piece of connection, feeling community, not feeling isolated, and really helping to build a strong learning disabled network. Moving on to anxiety, and this is something that is certainly prevalent in the neurodivergent community. Neurodivergent people are more than twice as likely to suffer with an anxiety disorder than neurotypical people. And I think the other thing to note is that anxiety in neurodivergent people, so in autistic people, learning disabled people, it sometimes presents a little bit differently than in neurotypical individuals. So it may go unrecognized or misrecognized. And there are a whole load of reasons why the autistic and learning disabled people may be more prone to anxiety. They have to deal with a sensory overload. So if you have a heightened sensitivity to light, sounds, crowds, your nervous system is going to be triggered more chronically and more persistently. Also, social camouflage, masking, which I think we're seeing more in females than in males. So masking to fit in is mentally exhausting, and it can lead to anxiety and burnout. Also, for autistic individuals, it's recognized that autistic people tend, not all, but a lot of autistic people can find uncertainty and unpredictability very difficult to manage. And so that can result in, so times of uncertainty or change of routine can result in a heightened anxiety as well. Putting the spotlight a little bit more on anxiety. So anxiety is a natural and quite normal, appropriate feeling of fear, dread, and uneasiness. And in its natural and appropriate form, it's a temporary reaction to stress. But for people with an anxiety disorder, that fear is not temporary and it can be overwhelming. And it's often not proportionate to the stress that it's directed at. So you might see, or an individual might experience an intense or excessive persistent worry and fear about everyday situations, or they might be left with a feeling of panic, which can interfere with their daily activities, and they lose proportion of the reaction to. They lose a proportion of their reaction to the thing that they're anxious about. The photograph is of on the slide here is of our LD advisor James, who not only has given permission for me to talk about him, but he has asked if I would talk about his experiences. So I'll just briefly brush over or talk a little bit about James. James has a learning disability and autism. He also struggles with anxiety, but in addition to that, he is a type 1 diabetic. So for James, something of a perfect storm can be created when his blood sugar levels don't behave in a predictable and expected way, because one, he finds that difficult to process. His learning disability makes it hard for him to make sense of that. His autism makes it hard for him to cope with a change in routine or lack of predictability, something not behaving in the right way, which throws his anxiety levels up. His high anxiety levels in that situation will interfere with his blood sugar regulation, which then causes his sugar levels to go up. And there we have a perfect storm. And it can escalate through no fault, and really there's very little he can do to manage that when that's happening, other than keeping a regular routine, keeping careful management of his diet, keeping fit and healthy, and doing exercise. So the reason for pointing that out with James is that James has chosen not to come to the personal best because he recognizes it as being a stressful day for him. His involvement is very much in the training and proofreading our training material for us, and our easy read material for participants. But I think it is worth mentioning that there will be a number of individuals who not only are managing a learning disability and neurodivergent brain differences, but they will also be dealing with some quite complex medical conditions, whether that's epilepsy, diabetes, arthritis, mobility problems, tummy problems, and so sometimes there's a lot going on below the surface that it's just worth keeping in mind. So moving back onto autism, and autism, as we mentioned, is a neurological difference or a brain difference affecting the way that the brain processes different types of information. So it affects how the brain communicates, how the brain thinks, the processing times, sensory information, and social. So our experts are going to tell us a little bit about how it affects them.
What is difficult for me about my autism is that you get people who are ignorant and difficult and do not understand. I have a lot of, and also I get a lot of problems when I'm out and about because people misread my behaviour.
Yeah, so for James, because his learning disability and autism really is a true hidden disability, sometimes his reaction and interactions can come across as him being tricky or difficult, when in fact he's just trying to understand what's going on around him. So moving on to communication, we're sticking with communication really. People with autism may have, and neurodivergencies, may have a different style of communication. As we've mentioned, speech may be absent. They may also use other modes of communication. So we have Makaton sign language that some people will communicate through a form of sign language. Some people will communicate through communication cards. Some will be much more gesture related. Those at the personal best, those who communicate through Makaton or gesture, they will have support workers with them who will be communicating, who will know them well, will communicate with them, and will be able to act a little as a translator if necessary. But I think the other point here is that language difference is quite important. It's really important with our guys to speak in clear and specific language that can sometimes sound a little bit direct. Avoid metaphors and sarcasm, and sometimes visual supports can help back up what we're saying. The guys may also have difficulty understanding non-verbal communication. There we're talking about facial expression, body language, things like that. They may need a little bit more processing time. So it was recently explained to me something called the 6-second rule, where I was told when I'm talking to somebody with autism, if I use an easy to understand sentence and say it clearly once, if it doesn't seem to be understood, to wait for 6 seconds, which seems like quite an uncomfortable length of time, and then to repeat it word for word again. And our sort of social temptation is to repeat it and rephrase it and frame it in a different way to see if somebody can understand it differently. But for a learning disabled and autistic mind, if you reframe it and rephrase your sentence, you're giving that individual a whole new set of words to have to process and to understand. So it is worth repeating slowly and clearly once. Don't keep on. If it's not being understood after you've repeated it maybe once or twice, then yes, it probably does need reframing. But don't just go straight to the reframe, because that can add extra work for them for processing. And I think this is not unique to people with autism or people with learning disability. I think this is for all humans, that our ability to communicate effectively definitely deteriorates under stress. And it's just understanding and recognizing the things that might be causing the guy stress. So Lisa tells us a little bit about the importance of clear communication for her.
My name is Lisa. I don't like it when people mumble, but I like it when people talk clearly.
Lisa's not keen on people mumbling, and one of the reasons for that, which we can't see on the clip, is that Lisa's quite hard of hearing and she wears hearing aids. So there's a very practical reason why mumbling is really difficult for Lisa. Now, our LD advisors here, I asked them if they could share with us why it's important to find the right balance when we're communicating with them, between being friendly and calm, but also encouraging, but not too much. And that balance is really important, but it's really sometimes quite difficult to gauge between different individuals. The clip kind of explains it better than I do.
Well, what I find difficult is when people try to push me to get to know them, or they get in my personal space. And what I don't find difficult is when people are trying to be friendly and helpful. I can accept that quite well. Well,
I do want people to be encouraging other people to be more positive. I do like people to cheer me, that's fine. Not too much.
I like people to talk slowly and calmly, not get my face in that, give me my own space in that.
It's quite hard to hit the right balance between being encouraging but also to be calm. And I think that is almost an impossible balance to strike. But it's certainly worth noting that some individuals appreciate being G'd up a little bit and appreciate the celebration and the thrill and the cheering, whereas for others that can be quite repelling. And just being aware that some may need a bit of space is really important. I mentioned a little bit about communication cards before. We have a stash of communication cards for each of our teams at the Personal Bests, so that if anybody is having difficulty finding words or difficulty communicating, they and their support workers are more than welcome to borrow the cards to help that along the way. We think about the social interactions that neurodivergent and particularly autistic people may find difficult. In particular, we're thinking about body language, tone, facial expressions, and they all add meaning to an interaction. And some would argue quite strongly that the words are only a really small part of the meaning of a communication. It's the body language, facial expression, and tone that provide the most meaning. And if you're not able to understand that, then sometimes subtleties or even less than subtleties are missed and misunderstandings can happen. And that happens to our guys quite often. So here's Anna explaining what she finds difficult around friendships.
I find friendships more difficult, and understanding and communicating.
So if you find it hard to understand and communicate, then I think it goes without saying that it would be really hard to maintain and manage friendships in a really consistently healthy way. I think it's really tough. It's difficult. So more on the social side for people with autism and learning disabled people, social situations can be really challenging. It's now sort of described as a double empathy problem, or sort of mutual mismatch. There's different processing styles between a neurodivergent and a neurotypical brain, so neither quite understand where the other is coming from. And that can be exhausting, and it can also lead to overload as well, particularly in really overwhelming environments. the photograph is the only personal best photograph I've got of two individuals looking really exhausted. And they were our two mascots, Tigger and Pooh, a couple of years ago, who'd been doing a really good job throughout the day, but they probably were a little bit exhausted at that point. So coming on to thinking or processing and the way that the brain processes information. Individuals may have difficulty in understanding that other people see things from a different point of view. So it's understanding that there are other perspectives in addition to their own perspective. We've mentioned a little bit, or I've mentioned a little bit about an inflexibility or rigidity around routine and repetitive activities. And a little bit on the communication piece in terms of literal interpretation of written and verbal instructions. So the pictures on the bottom are things that James and I walk regularly, and we quite often chat about what we refer to as silly phrases that normal people say that make no sense. Things like, it's raining cats and dogs. It's so easy, it's a piece of cake. Or when you go to the doctor's and you're asked to take a seat. Now, James finds these phrases partly funny and partly ridiculous. But also, I think what's important to mention is that these are the sorts of phrases that, although they're throwaway phrases and we use them neurotypically, we use them day in, day out. For some people with an autistic brain, especially those with a learning disabled and autistic brain, they're having to translate them every time that they're being used. And that's hard work, especially translating something that conjures up a fairly ridiculous image. The one James really hates is laughing their head off, because he can't see how anyone that would laugh their head off could possibly find that funny. He thinks that's a pretty awful phrase. And that final fourth area where the autistic brain has some differences is around sensory. So many people on the autism spectrum have difficulty processing everyday sensory information. Any of the senses may be either over, so hyper, or under, hyposensitive, or they can be both at different times. So these sensory differences can affect behaviour and can have a profound effect on someone's life. So we have 5 quite well recognised senses. We've got hearing, taste, touch, sight, smell, which I think are pretty well recognised. There are another 3 that I find particularly interesting, and the 3 on the bottom of the page there are proprioception. So that's an awareness of where your body or position is, or the position of your body is in space. That's something that some people will find really hard, or not so much hard or easy. It's something some people will lack. Vestibular, so balance and movement. Some autistic people, through having an under-responsive vestibular and proprioceptive senses, they will appear clumsy, but that's kind of because they can't help it. It's kind of, that's just how they're wired. The last one, which I think is particularly relevant to the personal bests and relevant to our understanding of some of the participants, is interoception, and that's an understanding of the messages that your body's trying to tell you. So it's an understanding or a sensitivity to perhaps feeling hungry, feeling like you might need the toilet, feeling thirsty, feeling tired, having a headache, feeling sick, and so on. And if you're either under-responsive or over-responsive with the way that you detect those signals, you can see how in a large group setting that could cause you a whole load of difficulty. So I think it's certainly it's worth being aware that if somebody says that they need the toilet, they probably need to go, or don't take any risk. It's worth expecting that they probably need to go right now. Likewise, if they say that they have a headache, then that's something that not worth battling through. That's something that they might want to just sit out and take some time out, and perhaps go and visit one of our quiet spaces. Again, their support workers will be helping with that. This is just an overview to give a little bit more insight. The personal best as a day has the potential to stimulate almost every sense. So there are lots of reasons why it could feel overwhelming. We've got lots of colour, we've got different things to look at, we've got noise, we've got smells, we've got people being accidentally knocked into, there's touch from different pieces of equipment, there's an awful lot of sensory input going on at the personal bests. Now, our LD advisor, Matthew, wanted me to talk to you guys a little bit about touch and what touch means to him. And here we're talking about physical touch, as in just physical contact. No inappropriate touch, just physical touch, appropriate physical touch. And what Matthew says is, if it's your family or someone you trust and rely on, that's okay for me. But it can be kind of scary and frightening to be touched by someone you don't know. Now, at the personal bests, we often give high fives, give hugs, we might hold someone's hand, we might tap someone on the shoulder. For somebody like Matthew, these are all touch. And these might all be touched by people he doesn't know very well, which could be, for him, deeply unpleasant. So when we were speaking, and he said that he really likes a fist pump. He's also okay with a thumbs up, but a high five for him can be too much. So it's just being aware that there are different ways of celebrating and encouraging. The other reason that I wanted to mention about Matthew was his advice around medals. At the end of the personal best, in our last activity, our volunteers help the coaches give out medals. And one of the things that Matthew in particular has explained to me is that he doesn't like it when a volunteer he doesn't know well tries to place a medal over his neck. He finds that, quite understandably, he finds that intimidating. He would prefer to be given his medal by hand and to put it on himself. So, and I thought, you know, if I hadn't have asked, and I hadn't have kind of tried to find these bits of information out, we'd be none the wiser, and we'd be giving individuals like Matthew a challenge that he really doesn't need to have to put up with. We can make his experience so much better by just understanding where he's coming from. I think more or less the last bits are about stimming. So stimming is self-regulatory behaviour. It's often repetitive sounds or movements to help manage emotions and to self-soothe. It is a natural behaviour and it can be really useful for autistic individuals. So although it's something that we may not be really familiar with seeing in a kind of neurotypical world, it's usually nothing to be particularly distressed about, but it can depend. So we have physical stims, which might be things like arm flapping, chewing, rocking, moving of fingers and hands. We have echolalia, which is the use of words, so repetitive words that sometimes sound a little bit like tics, but might be repeating words or making no sense, words in a nonsensical way. Those two types of stimming can be quite appropriate and self-soothing. The third type is more dangerous, it's unhealthy stims, where an individual may use pain or self-harm as a distraction. So head banging would be a classic example, and that's clearly not a healthy response to self-soothing. And that would be, again, something our support workers will be really well tuned to be picking up, or they certainly should be, and they're usually extremely good, but it's something just for us to be aware of. It's worth mentioning, having said quite a lot about the difficulties and the challenges that autistic people have, I think it's also really worth highlighting the sort of the many strengths and the real positive attributes that people with autism and learning disabilities have, but particularly in terms of autism. Autistic people generally, and again, this is a generalization, but generally have good visual skills. They can be highly knowledgeable in an area of special interest. They tend to have very good visual memory and really good factual memory. Our guys are brilliant to take to a pub quiz, and they're really good at creating questions for pub quizzes as well, because they kind of know lots of stuff. They can be really focused, and they can be quite good independent thinkers, bringing a unique perspective to problems. Precision and accuracy is important, as is loyalty and honesty. So they tend not to sort of brush over the truth. The truth is something that's really important to them. So here the guys just tell us about the things that they're really good at.
I'm good at remembering things, and I like being helpful.
What I'm good at is cooking and shopping as well.
I'm very good at organising myself and looking nice.
I'm good at football and badminton. I am good at getting out, good at being on time for things. Good at getting out in the morning.
So yeah, I love that Stuart's good at getting up in the morning and being on time for things, and that's completely true. He's really good at both of those things, and same with the others for their positives. Being active is really good for everyone. It's particularly good for people who are neurodivergent. It creates a huge amount of social value in addition to the physical and mental health benefits. The benefits in terms of social network, connection, building in confidence are really massive. So Anna tells us a little bit about the types of exercise she enjoys.
I like running, and I also enjoy circuits because it makes me feel good and makes me feel better afterwards.
You may be aware of the sunflower lanyard scheme. So a sunflower lanyard is a printed fabric with sunflowers on it to indicate a hidden disability. So some of the guys really like wearing their sunflower lanyard. They like people to know that they have a hidden disability, so that they can adjust the manner that they try to help them with. But others don't like to draw attention to themselves and prefer not to wear one. So although the sunflower lanyard is a really positive and really good scheme, it's not the right fit for everybody. And although having a learning disability and a learning disability with autism is a disability, it's really important not to underestimate a person's ability, and to flip that round and think about what they can do. And James has some quite a good top tip on that.
Top tip for helping people with autism is have manners, and don't just assume that we need to be helped. Ask us and be polite about it. Thank you.
Manners is an important one, and I love how James says thank you at the end. having given a pretty direct and scathing top tip, he says thank you with a smile at the end. Manners for our guys includes things like introducing yourself, telling them your name, saying please and thank you, asking politely, even adding, if you're giving an instruction, to say, I am asking you politely if you would do X, Y, or Z. So just to confirm that you really are meaning to be polite. And they don't like being bossed around, but then who does? Things that can be hard is change. The main thing at the personal bests that can change is the weather, and the weather causes us to have to move we have half the events inside and half outside, and if it's pouring with rain, we move everything inside. And that's often a decision we can't make until really quite close to the day, which means we can't give much notice and much warning to participants on how to prepare. So that's something just to be aware of, that change and the change in routine, so the change of not being half inside and outside, could cause upset to some in the, I want to say, unlikely event that it's going to rain, but I think it's looking increasingly likely, which is good for the garden, but bad for us. Reactions to stress. I don't think this is unique to autistic individuals. I think this is a human reaction to stress. I think the thing that's different is that it's sometimes not obvious what an autistic or learning disabled person is being stressed by, or sometimes sometimes that's difficult to understand or recognize. But agitation, anxiety, shutdown, so no communication, pacing around, ineffective stimming, so stimming a lot but it's not having that self-soothing effect, or anger and fear. Like with neurotypical people, if someone's really angry, you can't reason with the unreasonable. So there's no point trying to resolve something when anger levels are really high. It just doesn't work. So allow the person space, allow them space and time to calm down. Again, this is very much the role of the support and the carers, and they're usually really good at spotting when an individual might be starting to wind up, so that they can help sort of dissolve the situation before it escalates. The nice thing with the personal best is that there is lots of space, and so if someone needs to just have a bit of time out, then that's absolutely encouraged, and they're very welcome to take as long as they need. You might have noticed on the top of these slides, there's on the top top right, there's a little logo called Autism Ambassador. This is a scheme run through Southampton, Hampshire, Isle of Wight and Portsmouth that is encouraging people to spread the word about neurodivergency and autism, and really to make more people aware of the sort of adjustments and the sort of understanding that helps create a world where neurotypical and neurodivergent people can thrive, and where they can coexist on a more level playing field. And then that's the last one. Any questions? I'll stop sharing.